There's a strange thing that happens to almost everyone who's ever tried to save money, and it makes absolutely no sense on paper. Saving your very first $1,000 feels like climbing a mountain. It's slow, it's painful, and half the time you're convinced it's not even working. But somehow, once people get further along, saving their next $50,000 feels almost easy by comparison, even though that's 50 times more money. If that sounds backwards to you, you're not alone. Most people assume that as the numbers get bigger, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up, because what I'm about to explain is probably the single biggest reason people quit right before the hardest part is actually over. Let's start with what saving your first $1,000 actually looks like for most people, because it's brutal in ways that don't show up in any spreadsheet. You're not just trying to set money aside. You're trying to build an entirely new set of habits from nothing, while your old habits are still fully intact and fighting you the whole way. Every dollar you try to save has to be pulled directly out of your current lifestyle. There's no cushion helping you. There's no momentum. If you want to save $50 this week, that $50 has to come from you're doing all this work, all this sacrifice, for a number that still feels like nothing. This is why so many people quit around $200 or $300. Not because they're lazy, and not because they don't care about their future. It's because they're putting in real effort and getting almost no emotional payoff in return. Imagine going to the gym every single day for a month and the scale not moving even 1 pound. Most people would quit. And that's essentially what saving that first $1,000 feels like for a lot of people. Let's actually sit with this stage a bit longer, because I don't think it gets enough respect. Picture someone who's just decided they're finally going to take savings seriously. They open a separate account. The problem is that early-stage saving asks you to sacrifice something real and immediate in exchange for something abstract and distant, over and over, with almost no reinforcement along the way. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is the part that almost nobody explains properly. Once you cross that first $1,000, something changes that has nothing to do with the money itself. It's not that $1,000 suddenly earns you life-changing interest. It doesn't. The real shift is that you've just proven something to yourself that you didn't know for certain before, that you're actually capable of following through on a financial decision over time. That might sound like a small thing, but it's not. Before you hit that first milestone, saving money was theoretical. It was something you were a bad week doesn't threaten their identity, because the identity isn't built on a perfect streak. It's built on the pattern as a whole. Now let's talk about why the next chunk of money gets easier, and I mean genuinely, mathematically, psychologically easier, not just easier because you're used to it. The first reason is compound growth. And most people massively underestimate how much this actually matters, even at relatively small amounts. Let's say you've built up your savings to $10,000 and you've got it invested, earning a reasonable average return. That money is now generating growth on its own, without you lifting a finger. At $10,000, an 8% average return generates about $800 a year. That's not enough to retire on. Let's make this even more concrete, because numbers like this tend to slide right past people if we don't slow down. Imagine two people. Person A is saving $500 a month starting from zero. Person B is saving $500 a month, but they already have $40,000 invested. After 1 year, Person A has contributed $6,000, and assuming decent market performance, their account might sit around $6,300 to $6,500. Person B has also contributed $6,000, but their existing $40,000 has been growing the whole time too, adding somewhere around $3,200 in growth on top of their contributions. Same monthly effort. Same discipline. Wildly different results, purely because of what already existed before they started that year. This is why the phrase the dollar amount hasn't changed. Your relationship to it has. This works in your favor when you're trying to save more, too. Setting aside an extra $200 a month feels almost impossible when you have nothing. It feels significant when you have a small amount saved. But once you've built real momentum, that same $200 feels like a rounding error compared to the size of what you're already protecting. The sacrifice required to keep saving actually shrinks in your mind, even though the dollar amount might stay exactly the same or even increase. Think about how differently a $500 unexpected expense feels depending on where someone is in this journey. For the person with $200 in savings, willpower isn't unlimited. It's more like a muscle that gets tired throughout the day, which is exactly why so many people save well in the morning and blow their budget by dinner time when their willpower has run out. But habits work differently than willpower. Once saving becomes automatic, once it's a transfer that happens the same day your paycheck lands, before you ever see the money sitting in your checking account, you're no longer making a decision at all. There's nothing to resist, because there's no visible choice being presented to you. The people who successfully build large amounts of savings aren't fighting temptation more successfully than everyone else. They've simply structured their finances so temptation never gets a chance to show up in the first place. Multiply that by dozens of small purchases a week, and you can see why willpower runs out so fast. Habit maintenance, on the other hand, requires almost nothing. Once the transfer happens automatically and the remaining money in your checking account is simply what you have to work with, there's no negotiation left. The decision was made once, months ago, and it just keeps executing itself. Let's talk about something that trips a lot of people up around this stage, because understanding it will save you a lot of frustration. Even though later savings feels easier in general, there's still a temporary dip in motivation that happens right around the $5,000 to $8,000 range for a lot of people. This is usually where the this middle stretch is honestly where most people who eventually succeed almost gave up. If you talk to anyone who's built substantial savings and ask them about the hardest part of the journey, very few will point to the beginning or the end. Most of them point to this exact middle zone, where the progress felt too slow to be exciting but too far along to abandon without feeling like they had wasted everything already invested. Recognizing this stage for what it is, a temporary low point in motivation rather than a sign of failure, is one of the most useful things you can do for yourself financially. Here's something that will probably reframe how you think about this entire journey. People often assume that building wealth requires an ever-increasing amount of discipline as the numbers get bigger. That the person with $500 at the very beginning, when the numbers are small and the payoff feels invisible. It genuinely does get structurally easier from here, not because you'll suddenly develop more self-control, but because the system itself starts sharing the load with you. Let's talk about a few practical things that actually make this transition happen faster, because understanding the psychology is one thing, but there are specific structural choices that accelerate you through the hardest part. The first is automating the transfer before you ever see the money. This sounds almost too simple to matter, but it might be the single highest leverage decision anyone can make in this entire process. When saving requires an active, someone who successfully automates $25 a week for 3 months has built something far more valuable than someone who tried to save $400 a week and gave up after 2 weeks. The habit is the asset. The dollar amount is secondary until the habit is solid. The third is separating your savings account from anything you can access instantly. If your savings sits in the same account as your spending money, or even in a linked account you can transfer from in 10 seconds, you haven't actually removed the decision. You've just added a small speed bump. Real separation, a different bank entirely, an account without a linked debit card, creates enough friction that impulsive with the dollar amount hasn't changed. Your relationship to it has. This works in your favor when you're trying to save more, too. Setting aside an extra $200 a month feels almost impossible when you have nothing. It feels significant when you have a small amount saved. But once you've built real momentum, that same $200 feels like a rounding error compared to the size of what you're already protecting. The sacrifice required to keep saving actually shrinks in your mind, even though the dollar amount might stay exactly the same or even increase. Think about how differently a $500 unexpected expense feels depending on where someone is in this journey. For the person with $200 in savings, a $500 car repair is a genuine crisis. It might mean a credit card, a missed bill, or a stressful few weeks. For the person with $60,000 saved, that same $500 repair is an inconvenience they barely think about after the invoice is paid. The expense didn't change. The person's relationship to money did. The third reason, and this one's honestly the most important, is that your habits stop requiring active willpower once they're established. That first $1,000 required you to consciously decide, over and over again, hundreds of separate times, not to spend money you technically had access to. Every one of those decisions cost you mental energy.